Hello, and thank you for attending this workshop to discuss the Stormwater Post-Construction Requirements Update. My name is Haley Campbell. I'm a Senior Planner with the City of Springfield and the Project Manager for this code amendment. Also with me is Clayton McEachern, Civil Engineer, and Megan Murphy, Environmental Services Management Analyst. In a minute, we will start the presentation. As this workshop is pre-recorded, you will be hearing from the project team at various points during the presentation. Therefore, we ask that you mute yourselves and hold all questions until the end. We have set aside 20 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. Stormwater is an important part of the community's effort to improve water quality, protect fish habitat, and protect properties from flooding. When we say, go green and drink clean, we mean it. The reasons are twofold. The first, and perhaps most important, is that Springfield's potable water supply is sourced from groundwater aquifers. By protecting water quality and quantity through stormwater retention, we can help recharge our water supply as the city continues to urbanize, or ahead of potential climate change impacts like drought or unanticipated hazard impacts like flooding. And piggybacking off the first, our stormwater runoff flows from urban areas to storm drains, gutters, ditches, swales, or a system of pipes, and eventually ends up in the Mackenzie or Willamette rivers. Our stormwater system is not treated before emptying into our rivers and streams. To protect those waterways, Oregon DEQ issued the city a permit to address specific areas recognized as sources of stormwater pollution. In this presentation, we will cover what the MS4 permit is and why the city has one, what the permit requires, and where we are at with meeting those requirements. And at the end, we'll have time to ask a few questions and hear from the audience. A link to staff's contact information for follow-up questions will be provided along with drafts of the Development Code amendments.
Prior to Euro-American settlement, the Willamette Valley consisted of oak savanna, prairies, wetlands, and woodlands. Rain could soak into the ground, and about 10% made its way overland to rivers. As cities developed, these porous surfaces were gradually replaced with hard surfaces that did not allow rain to soak into the ground anymore. This profoundly changed natural hydrology, reducing groundwater recharge and increasing the amount and speed of runoff to our waterways. This can cause flooding and erosion in our streams and negatively impacts our native fish populations. Typical pollutants in stormwater runoff include pet waste, fertilizers, weed killers, litter, motor oil, sediment, zinc from moss treatments, tire wear chemicals, and more. When this toxic soup flows directly to our waterways, our water quality and wildlife suffer. In fact, stormwater runoff from urban areas is one of the biggest threats to water quality nationally. Because stormwater runoff from urban areas is one of the main sources of water pollution and alteration of hydrology, it is regulated under the Federal Clean Water Act. In Oregon, the Department of Environmental Quality, or DEQ, implements the requirements within the Clean Water Act on behalf of the Environmental Protection Agency. The MS4 permit requirements are the primary mechanism for ensuring our water bodies are swimmable and fishable. These permit requirements cover public education and outreach, elimination of illegal discharges to the stormwater system, preventing erosion at construction sites, and more. Directing runoff from urban areas to post-construction site runoff controls, such as rain gardens and swales, is one of the most effective ways to recreate natural hydrology and remove pollutants from stormwater runoff. The City of Springfield is mandated by its MS4 permit to require post-construction stormwater controls at public and private developments. This includes building new impervious surface and the replacement of old impervious surface. The first step to reduce the negative impacts of stormwater runoff is to implement practices that reduce hard impervious surfaces in the first place. Reducing building footprints and using porous surfaces are two examples of this. The runoff from the impervious surfaces at a site must be collected and retained by one or more post-construction stormwater controls. These can include rain gardens, rainwater harvesting systems, retention ponds, and more. These stormwater controls are often referred to as green stormwater infrastructure water quality facilities, or best management practices, or BMPs. Low impact development, or LID, refers to the comprehensive planning and engineering design approach to stormwater management with the goal of mimicking pre-development hydrology. Green stormwater infrastructure allows runoff to soak into the ground as it would have prior to development. Plants remove nutrients and trace metals from runoff that would otherwise harm aquatic life. The microbial community in the soil breaks down pollutants such as motor oil and tire wear chemicals. These facilities have a host of other benefits, including groundwater recharge, increasing native plants and pollinator habitat, and increasing green space. The plants and soils within green infrastructure are a proven method for reducing pollution and keeping our native salmon and other fish alive.
As discussed earlier, the MS4 permit requires the city to reduce discharge of pollutants and address stormwater runoff from new development and redevelopment project sites in its coverage area. This presentation will address the 7 topics for compliance with the permit. The City of Springfield must implement all required components of the permit by February 2024. With that being said, right now we are in the outreach phase of the project. The Stormwater team has drafted edits to the Development Code and Engineering Manual, or EDSPM, and the drafts are available for the public's input on our website or Springfield Oregon Speaks, our public outreach platform. We are also happy to schedule meetings with the public if they have questions and want to meet with staff. On August 1st, we will hold our first Planning Commission public hearing and expect that commissioners will hold the record open to deliberate later in September. Once a recommendation is issued, staff will take final drafts to the City Council on November 6th. Approval from City Council and the Board of County Commissioners is expected in January and February 2024, respectively. Next, the City must adopt through ordinance or other regulatory mechanism a size requirement for project sites that discharge stormwater to the MS4 and create or replace 5,000 square feet or more of impervious surface area, or for development projects that disturb 1 or more acres of land. Runoff from these developments must be captured by structural stormwater controls, which are physically designed, installed, and maintained facilities that prevent or reduce the discharge of pollutants to minimize the impacts on water bodies.
The city does not currently have any barriers to low-impact development, but our current standards are scattered across several different documents and some of it is subjective and hard to use. In the revisions to comply with the new MS4 permit, we have made changes to encourage development to use a low-impact approach to stormwater management. The proposed code and EDSPM changes will provide a clear way to meet the requirements using straightforward tools, especially for small-scale developments. We have adopted the City of Eugene stormwater facility size calculators to be used for developments less than an acre in size, allowing non-engineers to design LID features into the site plan. The Development Code has clear allowances for using the vegetated stormwater treatment areas and required setbacks, and the vegetation that count as part of the required site landscaping. The plant and tree lists have been updated and reformatted to be clearer and easier to use. A new section in the EDSPM has guidelines for use of pervious pavements to reduce overall impervious surfaces and meet the new on-site retention standard. The current code does not have any specific performance standards for runoff other than limitations on downstream capacity of the storm system, which could be difficult to establish and was subjective. A large part of the current city's stormwater system is at or over capacity, and this results in most current development being required to infiltrate as much water as possible on site currently. The proposed standard is to retain a total volume of water equal to 1.4 inches of runoff from the site in 24 hours. The volume is the same as the City of Eugene and is based on data analysis of the historic rainfall amounts so that 80% of all storm events will not generate runoff from sites that meet this standard. For the sites that can meet this standard, we'll primarily do it with on-site infiltration in stormwater treatment facilities, and the use of volume standard encourages a low-impact approach to site stormwater design, and a large amount of the City of Springfield has soil conditions suitable for on-site infiltration. The city's proposed new code is also adopting all the same standard vegetated facilities that can be found in the Eugene Stormwater Manual, which when sized with the calculators are able to show if the site meets the standard for on-site retention. Where the retention standard can't be met, then the runoff is still required to be fully treated before leaving the site to a standard that removes at least 80% of the total suspended solids. This should be done primarily with vegetation and only mechanical treatment used as a last resort. There are clear requirements in the proposed development code for what conditions warrant a reduced volume in the case of limited infiltration capacity or no infiltration capacity available. In the case of no infiltration capacity available, a flow rate standard is supplied in the development code. The provided calculators already have this built in as available options when site conditions warrant them, and where mechanical treatment is approved in the state of Washington's TAPE list is to be used for evaluating mechanical treatment effectiveness in meeting the required 80% reduction in total suspended solids. The site performance standard of 1.4 inches at 24 hours retained on site, and then quality treatment to remove 80% of the total suspended solids for sites that cannot meet this standard will work together so that runoff generated from new development in Springfield will meet the requirements of our MS4 permit, will maintain and restore a more natural hydrologic cycle, keep our stormwater drainage system from being overwhelmed, and help keep our rivers clean. Numerical standards are required by the MS4 permit. Research for what would be a reasonable standard for our community led us to mimic the standards used by the City of Eugene for rainfall. This numeric standard was chosen so that 80% of all storms will be treated and infiltrated when possible on site. A common industry standard is to test for 80% removal of total suspended solids, and most current proprietary mechanical systems and practically all properly built and maintained vegetated systems meet this standard.
For projects that trigger the size requirements and choose to implement either the site performance or treatment standard, the city will continue to review and approve plans for consistency with the ordinance and development code. The amended Springfield Development Code outlines the requirements for stormwater study standards and their types. 2 stormwater study types are permitted: a small site stormwater study and a full site. A small site stormwater study may be completed for sites that are less than 1 acre in size, meet the site performance standards in the Springfield Development Code for stormwater, and does not contain or is abutting a floodplain or wetland. For sites that cannot meet the small site, a full site stormwater study is required. Each stormwater study must contain a written narrative describing the stormwater management approach, a hydrological study map, a report that describes any impact to a floodplain or floodway, and calculations to establish runoff volumes, peak flows, and pipe size. This amendment project includes not only the Springfield Development Code, but also the Engineering Manual, or EDSPM. There's an important distinction between the two. The Springfield Development Code governs land and development within the city's urban growth boundary, and the Engineering Manual contains standards and procedures for public infrastructure, including our transportation, sewer, and stormwater. As part of this amendment project, sections of the EDSPM that apply to private development, such as site plan review or land divisions, will be added to the Development Code. Construction specifications and design standards that only apply to public infrastructure approvals or that are non-mandatory guidelines will remain in the EDSPM.
Maintaining green infrastructure is crucial for ensuring the long-term effectiveness of these facilities and for meeting our water quality goals. The MS4 permit requires the city to ensure that structural stormwater controls installed in Springfield are operated and maintained to meet site performance standards. Developers are required to sign an operation and maintenance agreement and provide an operation and maintenance plan for each type of stormwater facility at a site. The operation and maintenance agreement requires the responsible party, typically the property owner, to regularly inspect and maintain their facilities according to the operation and maintenance plan. Operation and maintenance requirements include ensuring good vegetation coverage, at least 90% at maturity with approved species, and maintaining soil permeability. This is because plants are the primary component of these facilities, removing pollutants and increasing infiltration. In addition, most of our drinking water in Springfield comes from groundwater, so it is especially important to have good coverage with healthy plants. The City of Springfield's MS4 permit requires us to provide education and outreach to contractors, developers, planners, engineers, architects, and the general public about the impacts of stormwater runoff on water bodies and the steps that can be taken to mitigate these impacts. The purpose of this workshop is to inform the development community about the new requirements within the City of Springfield's MS4 permit and to gather feedback from you about our proposed code changes to meet these requirements.
So where are we at now with the stormwater post-construction requirements update? Drafts of the Development Code and Engineering Manual edits can be found on Springfield Oregon Speaks and on the website. We welcome any and all feedback. An internal technical advisory group has reviewed drafts of the Development Code and provided their commentary. We are now reaching out to the public for their comments, questions, or concerns. During draft review, staff contacted local arborists and landscape architects to receive feedback on the city's facility plant and street tree lists. The lists have been amended to include criteria for approval of species not currently on the list and to be consistent with Eugene's 2014 Stormwater Management Manual facility planting design. Non-native invasive species are not allowed in stormwater facilities, and only natives are allowed in stormwater facilities within natural resource protection area setbacks. A minimum of 3 unique species are required per facility for species diversity. Following the 2 public workshops, the next opportunity for public comment can be provided at the Planning Commission public hearing on August 1st. In a minute, we will move on to the question and answer discussion portion of the presentation. Thank you for attending this workshop. If you would like to provide feedback or view drafts of the code, please see the Springfield Oregon Speaks or Public Works links on this page or reach out to staff. We would now like to hear from the audience on the following discussion points. 1. Do you have any questions or comments for staff about the stormwater post-construction amendments? 2. Do you have any concerns about the feasibility of meeting the site performance standard, capture the first 1.4 inches of rainfall, or treatment standard, remove no less than 80% of total suspended solids, or about how reporting and enforcement is handled in Springfield? 3. Are there any other questions we can answer?
So I'm just going to go ahead and pause the recording, but we will open it up for discussion now. If anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself, and we're here to help answer those.
Would you be able to summarize maybe the difference between how the 5,000 square foot limit, or is that a maximum? Or no, I guess it's a minimum. Is that a minimum?
All right, we're working on the volume internally now a little bit.
We have our volume up very high so you guys can hear us.
Yeah.
Or our recording.
What was that question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I guess I was having a little bit of hard trouble hearing the recording a little bit, but there was the 5,000 square foot, like, is it the impervious?
Yeah, 5,000. So our new threshold for requiring a stormwater report is 5,000 square feet of new or replaced impervious surface on the site. If it's below that, you still need to show in the site plan where the drainage is going, but you don't have to do a site plan, nor do you have to introduce any water quality measures. With the quick exception, there's different rules that apply to middle housing, and if there's no outlet to the public system, you still then have to manage it on site, same as it is right now.
Okay.
Roseanne, I don't know if you're the first person to raise your hand, but we'll tap you in next. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you guys. Good morning, afternoon, sorry. So I think my questions are about sort of before and after, because I'm just getting started working in Springfield. So essentially, I'm curious about, the planters and the swales, some of the BMPs and lid opportunities that might have been used with some consistency in the past in residential subdivisions versus what will be more of the norm going forward. And then secondly, there was a quote in the presentation indicating something to the effect that Springfield soils are such that most water should be able to be infiltrated on site. And so could you elaborate upon that? Specifically, will dry wells be allowed for individual lots or groups of lots for, you know, underground infiltration of the stormwater?
Yeah, do you want to tackle the soil
I
question?
can talk about some of definitely the soil question. So it's still going to be site by site, and there is a appendix to the development code now that for infiltration testing to establish your actual infiltration limits on site. That being said, my experience has been a fair amount of the city, easily over a half and probably closer to 3/4 of at least the flat areas of the city have good infiltrate or acceptable infiltration rates. Good might be a stretch. It is highly dependent on the site though, and sometimes two sites next to each other have wildly different rates.
Dry wells are still allowed, right?
Dry wells are still allowed in some circumstances. They're not allowed in 1 to 2 year time of travel zones when they're next to a wellhead because the risk of contamination is too high. Otherwise, they're still allowed, and they're still allowed for residential rooftops in all zones. If it's residential rooftop water only that's going to the dry well. Meaning if your downspouts from your house can be hooked up directly to a dry well or soakage trench, regardless of the wellhead zone. But every other kind of dry well or soakage trench has to be treated, and they're not allowed at all in low time of travel areas for like commercial or industrial or parking lots, stuff like that.
Okay, so what about a residential subdivision that also has some impervious coming from like the driveway or the back patio, for example?
So
that's not rooftop.
No, then if the water's being commingled, then it has to be treated before it can be infiltrated. That being said, several of our stormwater facilities, and like I said, we have unofficially been using the city of Eugene's catalog for quite a while now, years. And now we've made it official. We've adopted it into our code, all their typical details. So for rain gardens or infiltration planters or all that, it's pretty much the same. And you could then use those for infiltrating that water. It just has to go through a treatment facility first before it can be infiltrated.
Okay.
And you don't have to have a dry well downstream of that. It can just infiltrate through the planting medium of that, and that counts as the treatment. You don't have to have two separate facilities if it's a facility that's built to infiltrate anyway.
We still have the 24-inch media requirement.
We do for any kind of infiltration facility. Instead of just 12 inches in a 0 to 5 year time of travel zone, you have to double your topsoil from 12 inches to 24 inches.
And it has to have organic.
Yeah, the common planting bed material from Rexius and Lane Forest Products meets the requirements. There's technical requirements that are in the manual. It amounts to 50% organic material in the soil.
Okay, and that's already in the E.
That was a requirement that got carried forward. That was already there previously. That's nothing new.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. All the time of travel zone stuff is not new at all. Those restrictions are just carried forward, and instead of it just being part of subs code, it's now written into our development code as well.
Okay, perfect. And what section is that in the development code?
Well, it's 4.3110. I don't know the individual letter off the top of my head.
Oh, that's okay.
All the new stuff is 43110.
Okay, and that's in there, like in the current version of the or that this is proposed and this is what's going to go to the planning commission in August.
Yes, that's correct. The proposed version is in there. So we're working on getting it updated to the City of Springfield's website. But if you go onto our Springfield Oregon Speaks link that was provided a minute before we opened the discussion, that has drafts of all of this code in there, including the new updated appendices, some things that were moved over from the engineering manual or EDSPM to the code. But the main sections that were touched were 4.3110, which is the current stormwater section, and then various other sections to encourage more LID throughout the code.
Remove some contradictions we had.
Yeah, and remove contradictions and errors.
The biggest changes are actually in the EDSPM, where a whole lot of all of Chapter 3 was moved to the development code, which Chapter 3 in the EDSPM was stormwater quality, where all our treatment requirements were. They're now in the development code. And then chapter 4 has our actual nuts and bolts of how to design a storm system kind of thing. And that's where our sizing calculators and all the standard details are located. And once again, they're direct copies of the Eugene manual, forms and details.
But they're a carryover, correct?
Yeah, we just had them incorporated by reference before, and now we've actually brought them into our own documents. But we have been using these same standards for years now and accepting them.
You could say they become codified now.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
So requirements.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The day-to-day development of most sites will not really change from what was required before to what is required now. Except the standards got a lot clearer and easier and not nearly as subjective to city staff interpretation was a big effort that we did.
All right, moving on. Thank you.
Well, did we get all your questions?
Yeah, I think
you had several. I wanted to make sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Sean Highland, I believe your hand was raised next. Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. Well, Clayton did answer my last question. It sounds like everything will be the same as the design side going forward. What I didn't hear a lot about was any changes to post-construction and maintenance development. Is there going to be some more information coming about that?
It'll be pretty similar to what it is now. So you'll still have to sign the maintenance agreements and provide the operation and maintenance plans. There's a few more details in appendix.
We have an appendix, a dedicated appendix in the development code that covers it all.
Yes. Yeah. So in our current code, we don't have very many appendices. We have one for Glenwood, and now we will have several from the EDSPN covered into the code.
So like you'll have to keep the maintenance log on site.
From what it sounds like to me, yeah, because every time we were doing these, you guys would reference Eugene and there was a back and forth. Well, you guys don't have a design standards and we always worked it out. So that's just getting formalized. Oh, and then site plan review will be when we still do this stormwater design work.
Yes, the facilities, plant list, or planting landscaping plan will all have to be done at site plan review for private facilities. Some of it, depending on, like if it's a big residential subdivision that's going to have city-owned stormwater facilities, like Barcola Meadows that we used on the slides. Some of that can be deferred to PIP, but for the most part, it'll all have to be done at site plan review.
All right, we'll get through all my questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Sarah, your hand is raised next. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Thank you for all this. I heard you say that the smaller sites, the 5,000 square foot and under, were using the City of Eugene sizing guidelines. Are you doing the same for 5,000 and over? Like the City of Eugene as a whole presumptive approach spreadsheet to use for those larger sites?
So the presumptive and simplified approach sheets from the City of Eugene, we just copied directly over. Same spreadsheets. I didn't really change the spreadsheets at all. I took, except take the City of Eugene stuff off. So the 5,000, if you're introducing less than 5,000 square feet of impervious surface, you don't need to do a stormwater report at all or any stormwater measures, except manage it and get it out to the public system. Meaning, you still can't shed water into your neighbors, stuff like that. Just the common sense Oregon law stuff. But if it's over 5,000 square feet, then you need to do a stormwater report. If your total site is less than 1 acre in size, you can use a small site study. There's some other caveats to that, but that's in general. And the calculators can be used as long as no more than one basin is larger than 15,000 square feet in size. So if one stormwater treatment facility is treating more than 15,000 square feet of impervious area, you have to go to the full site study. But as long as each individual, because a lot of times for parking lots, say, your stormwater is spread out throughout the whole site. So each individual basin may only be 5,000-10,000 square feet each, and then you can use a presumptive calculator, or even the simplified if it's and both of those are very conservative, and so the facilities tend to be a little bit bigger than they would be if they were carefully engineered. But it's usually in the development's favor to do it that way. It's much faster, simpler, straightforward. And there's usually room to spare by incorporating the stormwater into the landscaping, so it's not that big a deal. They have them a little bit oversized.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, next, John Webster.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for presenting this information. I'm curious. Prior to this change, anytime that we were doing stormwater sort of things for commercial work in particular, we'd have to send this information to sub for review. And I'm wondering if that is something that's going to be eliminated at this point. We're going to eliminate the separate review by sub.
Not if it's in a drinking water protection area. That will continue to be in the code.
So there will be the stormwater review from the city of Springfield, and then there will be a separate review also by sub as well.
Yes, if it's in a drinking water protection area.
I see. Okay. All right. So it's just so I just want to make sure we're clear. We're adding another step, in that process for commercial development in those development zones.
It's the same as it currently is, where you have to get a drinking water permit through sub's drinking water protection zone office. Amy Chinitz is who currently runs it.
Mm-hmm.
You currently have to get that if you're within a wellhead protection zone and certain activities. All of those are staying the same. That's not being updated. So you will still have to obtain that permit after this is, I was about to say tomorrow, but after this permit is adopted, as you did yesterday. For that, we did incorporate some of the protections that sub was requiring. We've incorporated into our code for drinking water protection zones directly. For obvious reasons, we all want to protect the drinking water. But the requirements and the standards you have to meet are not changing at all for the drinking water protection zones as part of our code update, because that's required by sub through their system and their overlay.
So I guess my public comment would be: is there a way to incorporate the information that sub is reviewing into your review so that we eliminate that additional review?
We have reached out to Amy Chinitz at sub for her comments and sub's comments about the drinking water protection area, but we will not be making those changes or incorporating any changes from, I guess you could say, outside of the requirements for protecting the water and the aquifer zones. That is still continuing to be the same as it is in the development code, as Clayton mentioned a minute ago. So these are the drinking water protection areas are just extra steps to protect, I guess you could say, our aquifer, our drinking water, or potable water. So we add those in addition to our code for those purposes. So this is just in addition to stormwater.
Haley,
and if you're doing there's Amy.
Would that be okay if I jump in for a minute here?
Yes,
Like that? Yeah, I just want to clarify. So the drinking water protection overlay is part of the Springfield Development Code. And so when an applicant is subject to that, and that's typically if it's a commercial or industrial use that meets a certain threshold of hazardous materials, then they submit a drinking water protection application, but it's a City of Springfield application and the fees go to the City of Springfield. So it's not really a separate review in the sense that, sub acts as an advisor to that and provides comments on it. But when the permit is generated, it comes through the city. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. It's not a separate process with a separate application through sub. The only thing that gets submitted directly to sub is the drinking water protection exemption. And that was just designed to kind of streamline things and say, if for an applicant to have the opportunity, if they don't meet that threshold of hazardous material quantities, and they don't have to go through that whole process with the city. And I'd be happy to, offline to answer more questions about that process for anyone who has them.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Amy.
I was going to answer.
Yes.
SSW's
So
question.
SSW asked a question: how does Springfield define replacement versus repair of impervious surface?
So it's actually defined in the MS4 permit itself. What it amounts to is if you are putting down new paving, that's a replacement. Milling up putting down new, I think it includes overlay. Well, not strictly overlay. I think you have to remove pavement and put down new pavement for it to count as replacement. Of course, new rooftop, new any of that. The 5,000 square foot exemption should allow most, virtually all existing single unit home sites to have a house built without any, as long as there's a public system available. ADUs will no longer need a stormwater review other than how you're getting the water out to the street. Stuff like that, but it will capture larger developments, any kind of multi-unit subdivision or multi-lot subdivision will be captured. That's where the 5,000 square foot, which we discussed at length, the correct number for that. And it was a compromise. And it may be fine-tuned a year or two down the road as we see how it actually develops. Did that answer your question?
SSW is still here. I think so.
So under the 5,000 square feet, you can still go out to the street.
Yes, or a pipe. Depending on the circumstances, a weep hole might be appropriate, or a direct connection to an existing stormwater main, depending on the site and what's available. That's still going to be a little bit of a subjective call, but you won't have to do stormwater treatment or mitigation on site if it's less than 5,000 square feet and you have the public system available, and curb and gutter counts as the public system. I don't want to mean you have to have a storm drain physically in front of you.
But you said something about middle housing was different.
So the requirements for middle housing, anything that's processed under a middle housing application, which is defined in that part of the code, you can't have any increase from the existing runoff, meaning you have to show no rise on that condition. And that's written into the middle housing code.
So if there was already a house there before and then they got torn down, would it just have to meet what the impervious surface of that previous house was? Or
yeah, and if it's just a single unit house being replaced by a new single unit house, there would be, once again, you just have to show how your downspouts are connecting out to the street or wherever the destination is. But say you were tearing down an existing home and putting up a fourplex, well, then the middle housing review kicks in and you have to manage the water on site for the increased in impervious area. But if your overall increased impervious area is 0 or negligible, I'm not going to be tracing it down to the individual square inch or anything ridiculous like that. Then you don't have to do anything.
Okay.
Isn't that replacement of impervious surface?
But it's less than 5,000 square feet.
Right, but if it was over 5,000 square feet of replacement,
so this is just that would trigger regardless. But if it's middle housing, any reasonable increase in impervious surface is going to generate more runoff. So you have to mitigate that increase for middle housing. That was largely done to middle housing is going to go into a lot of existing neighborhoods that do not have very good storm drainage systems. And if we see a lot of new middle housing come in, it's going to cause a lot of problems in those existing neighborhoods. Whereas for new neighborhoods that are coming in, the lots are smaller, the density is already there, and we'll be capturing that. And then for vacant lots in existing neighborhoods, we didn't want to keep on going through stormwater review for every single lot or ADU in an existing neighborhood. Those areas are almost always, it's either incorporated into the storm drain system or the total impervious area added is right at 1,000 square feet for ADUs. So it was considered we were going to, in interest of getting that expedited, leave that alone.
All right, we have hit about 2 o'clock.
Oh.
We can continue if people want to. Otherwise, thank you for attending. We'll still continue to be here and answer any questions. I think John Webster, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I had another question in regards to commercial properties. I'm sorry, I mainly work in commercial work. So when working on a larger facility and dealing, I'm curious about how the relationship between like parking space and treatment area space is going to be addressed, and if there is going to be the opportunity to do some trade-off with parking requirements, to reduce parking requirements to expand the space of water treatment.
So that's a complicated question right now. I'm going to speak a little bit outside of my expertise, so hopefully I don't get it wrong. So there's the new CFAC rules that basically don't require any parking for most of the city. If you're within, I think it's half a mile of a frequent transit network, meaning MX or Main Street, which that's a whole lot of the city, there are no parking requirements. The city doesn't have any. We can't require them. We can't enforce them. Outside of that, it's kind of a case by case basis, I think. And our parking requirements were not very high to begin with. But that being said, if you do, the commercial development needs, and most do, some kind of parking lot, you'll have to treat all that water. We did incorporate a new, very comprehensive and straightforward, like if you're going to use impervious pavement to do it, what you have to do, because that was a little bit ambiguous before too, we felt.
Permeable pavement.
Permeable pavement, yeah. I'm sorry, yeah. And we introduced a lot of stuff specifically in the code, so it's easy to incorporate stormwater with the required site landscaping and setbacks as much as possible. We were always allowing that, but we made it explicit and exactly stated, you know, when it's okay and when in the few circumstances it's not okay. So we tried to do it as much as we could to minimize impact to sites and incorporate the stormwater around the edges, parking lot islands, stuff you needed to do anyway for the site to work, without having to have a huge footprint of dead space in your lot.
And the CFAC parking code updates will be following also the same timeline as the stormwater project. So look for that in August.
Okay.
But currently we can't, my understanding is we cannot enforce parking for anything within half a mile of one of the MX lines or the Main Street bus line.
Sure. I just know there's a lot of work that I'm working on that's up, you know, around Gateway area, or if there's there's also that area up around Mohawk and stuff like that. So
Yes.
that those areas have they've got a lot of parking requirements, you know, and it requires a lot of parking for commercial spaces. And if we're going to try and treat that much impervious area, then it starts eating away at the parking spaces available, you know. So that's where I was asking as to whether or not there was a trade-off available.
It can. I will say both of those areas actually tend to have very good infiltration rates, just based on stuff we've seen over the last 10 years.
Sure.
So that lets you reduce the size of that quite a bit if you've got a good infiltration rate. It does have to be engineered. The calculators we provided are, like I said, very conservative and based around 2 to 2.5 inches an hour infiltration rate. If you have better infiltration rates than that, you can shrink those facilities quite a bit, but it has to be done by a PE.
Okay. So that actually brings up another question. Is there, does the city of Springfield have a map that sort of indicates what infiltration rates are throughout the city that might be able to be used as a guide? So those have to be done by geotech for each site?
Well, it doesn't have to be done by a geotech. It can be done by a professional engineer. And in some cases, and once again, it's in the appendix to the development code. I forget, I want to say it's G, but I may be way off. The specific appendix that says how to do infiltration rate. Appendix C.
Right.
And if you wanted to go read the infiltration appendix testing in the City of Eugene manual, I copied theirs.
Right.
And modified it a little bit for us, but
sure. That just basically tells you where to dig test pits and what your amount of fill has to be per hour, all that stuff. Yeah. So I guess it is adding another additional cost to that. It starts, you know, I mean, I understand, and I'm wholeheartedly, you know, applaud the work to try and clean up water and to filter water before it gets out to our rivers or into our drinking water again. But there's also the concern, just trying to be an advocate for those developers who are trying to develop projects, and they're going to find these to be additional fees and additional burdens to their development, slowing their development down.
And to speak to that a little bit, for Mohawk, and it depends on the individual site. The storm drainage system around Mohawk is stressed already. And so for the most part, we required infiltration to be done on site because of a downstream capacity problem. And now we've just made basically the same requirement blanket all over the whole city. On Gateway, it varied tremendously where you're at, whether the system was at capacity or not. There's there's some very big stormwater lines we put in out of Gateway, mostly when the hospital went in, that actually have a lot of capacity. So in some cases it will be, but once again, the MS4 permit required us to do this. Like it wasn't, it's not, some of this stuff is just not an option. It's required by the state agency and the Clean Water Act, is where some of this is coming from, or where most of this is coming from. We tried to remove the stuff that was subjective, like staff subjectivity about, is there adequate capacity? Well, you either have to do a very expensive detailed engineering analysis to determine that, or you have to go off staff's opinion. And we tried to be as fair as we could on that, but my engineering opinion is not a substitute for doing the actual work of analyzing the capacity and doing the hydrology, but that's a big heavy lift that would have to be done in some cases. And now it's just, like I said, if you meet this on-site retention standard, and if you can't meet that because your site doesn't infiltrate, say you get a site that's just heavy clay, it's not going to infiltrate a drop. Well, we have allowances for the code on that. You still have to treat that same amount of water, but it doesn't have to infiltrate on site. So you can have an increase in stormwater runoff in those cases. Once
It
you
just
prove
turns
that
to
you can.
retention instead of infiltration.
Well, retention, what we mean, you can retain on site other methods. Those are still acceptable, but that takes a whole lot of, it's very expensive and it takes a lot of space.
Right.
Whereas if you can show that you can infiltrate on site to meet that, we're not going to put the undue burden of, well, now half your site has to be a giant water tank. We're not going to do that. That's not a reasonable, but you have to go through the infiltration testing, and quite often it will require a investigation from a PE to relax those standards. And we require you to infiltrate, even if you can't meet the full 1 1/4 inch volume. If you can meet half of that, that's still great. You have to design it to do that, and then the excess will be allowed off once it's fully treated. The treatment cannot be waived. That's a hard limit in our MS4 permit.
Sure.
So even if you can't, like I said, you got a heavy clay site, you can't infiltrate a drop. You still have to run it through a treatment train to get to that 80% suspended solids removal. And we do allow occasionally, it's very rare, but we even occasionally allow mechanical treatment when something else isn't going to work. Once again, that's going to be a subjective thing that we negotiate as part of the site plan review.
Okay, cool. Thanks again.
All right, I think we are going to end the recording. And if you have any questions, please follow up with staff. Like I said, the drafts of the development code will be posted online along with this video recording that I apologize we were having some technical errors with, but it will be available for anybody who wants to listen to it after the fact. So thank you for attending. We really appreciate it. We're here to answer any questions or hear your comments. So thank you. Thank you very much.